Hello, I'm very pleased to be able to talk with you today. I'm going to speak about the sparks that led to the writing of my various books. Always that hinges on a story, a narrative with characters, plot, action, suspense, and of course, for narrative nonfiction, these elements are shaped from real life events. And always I ask, and this is pinned above my desk, my writing desk, the question, what's the story? What can I learn from here that is new and exciting? Has this story been told before? Is there a chance of carving out some new ground with this? And what can I do to help in this situation? For me, that's all part of the journey constructing the narrative. So I'll talk about how I obtained these stories and shaped them into narratives in my talk today, which led to my books and which has also led to other work as well. So I was always looking for stories and lucky in my early 20s to get on this expedition. In the early 1970s, I was hungry for a big story and to do something that was new, fresh, exciting, full of adventure, a little dangerous, maybe, okay, not too dangerous. And we were four of us on a 32-foot sailboat with no engine. That was our captain's idea of a purest way to approach the ocean and to try to experience killer whales for the first time in their natural habitat. At that point, they'd never been filmed before. We had no experience sailing and really no experience on expeditions, and except for our captain. And we didn't actually have much luck either, and at least initially. We sailed up the British Columbia coast, the west coast of Canada, decided to go out outs what they call uh, right in the Pacific, not the Inside Passage. And I've put this little icon here, a scene of disaster. And you can see it spinning. That was the first thing that happened, was that we had a man overboard once we got into big swells, and fortunately rescued him, and decided to turn around and to head back up the east coast of Vancouver Island. Later that night, the captain relinquished the helm to one of us, and with our inexperience, put the boat on the rocks in American waters. You know, we'd sailed from Victoria in Canada, and fortunately, it was superficial um, damage to the boat. We were able to rock the boat off and get going again. And then proceeded the next day to get into one of the biggest storms of the season in Georgia Strait, even though it was supposedly protected waters. Those seas can build up really quickly. And, you know, all we could say was disasters are always good for stories. So that was the starting point for our expedition. And we were washed up with all of our carefully packed expedition, spilling into the bilge and everything else. And we had a couple days of cleanup and restoration before we got back on the boat and started sailing up the British Columbia coast. Now, on the one hand, for this story, if we could find them, we had this extraordinary predator at the top of the food pyramid that actually ate not only fish and squid, but large whales hunting in packs. And really, very little was known about them at that time. But from stomach studies, when they would strand on the beaches, scientists had found marine mammals, fish, squid, birds, turtles, just about anything in their stomach. And it was all part of this sort of great backstory for orcas. And we found, after a couple of weeks of searching, we found orcas for the first time, and it was our revelation. Our first revelation was that orcas tended to be specialists, and we saw them traveling around with other whales and not bothering them, and so we realized these were fish eaters, and these other whales we began to realize were these other orcas that hunted other whales were a different kind of orca. So these were all different kinds of orca food in different parts of the world. And our resident orca families, the ones that we got to know and that we saw all the time, were dedicated fish eaters. And we would spend a lot of time with them that summer and get to know them as individuals. This was the area where we were coming in, a beautiful, unlogged, untouched river valley on eastern Vancouver Island. That's a bull called Wavy. The bulls have the really big dorsal fins. And we set up a camp in this area and anchored the boat and started to get to know the locals, including Nicola was one of the first whales that we got to know, along with Stubbs. And at that same in that same first summer, we were lucky that a scientist, Dr. Michael Bigg, was just starting his work to identify individual orcas and to spend time with them in the wild. And so we were able to help out on this as part of this study and get to know them and to find out more about them as he was learning about them. So I've just circled some of the dorsal fins so you can see the distinctive marks. And what we found was if you took a sharp photograph, you could identify every single orca. And that really opened the door to behavioral studies and also finding out in the following years if the same whales were there or not. Now, that detective work of identifying individuals also allowed us and Michael Bigg to go back to photos taken at the time of the captures, and this was what was happening during this period. For the previous 5 or 10 years, killer whales were being captured in our area and sent to SeaWorld and other aquariums. And when we learned that, in fact, it was the same whales we were seeing that were having members of their pods taken and put into captivity and dying a lot sooner than they would in the wild, we began to realize that this was not a great situation. And, aquariums did help diffuse that killer label. And I think they served a purpose in the early years when people thought they were very dangerous. But over time, we realized this was not a good situation, and they were really taking huge numbers of whales from the wild. So part of the study was to try to determine how many or if any could be taken. This was a prize catch that one aquarium managed to catch, including a young female all-white killer whale called Chimo, who died a couple years after being in captivity in Victoria. Very interesting pod that were all captured. And I go in my first book, Orca, the Whale Called Killer, I talk about a lot of these stories that we were able to dig up about all these pods and what their histories were. And, it was fascinating learning about this. Our ideas changed over time. When I first took this photo, I thought, well, there's a big male, the bull, with the 6-foot dorsal fin, and the female on the far right. And and a calf in the middle, and maybe this is like a traveling playpen or something. But in fact, what this is a mother on the right called Scar, who is leading her full-grown son, Topnotch, and her new calf. And in fact, those males travel with their mothers for life, which can be 30 years. And the female calves grow up to, become mature maybe at 12, 15 years old, and then become new mothers. And they'll still travel close to their mother, but in a sort of sub-pod or subgroup, not far away. So we began to realize these were really permanent arrangements. We met a lot of younger killer whales that would often come beside the boat. The couple called the twins. They weren't actually twins, but they always hung out together. We had a good time with them. They were often sort of coming up really close to our boat and swimming all around. And also led us to this interesting place called the rubbing beach. And initially we didn't think there could be a place where they rubbed on rocks, because all the rocks in northern Vancouver Island were really barnacle encrusted and very sharp. And so we thought, well, maybe we didn't know what they were doing in this place, but every afternoon they would come to a particular area just offshore, and their behavior would be really different than what they were normally doing when they were hunting or just traveling along. And then we'd see on the backs of some of this is one of the twins. You could see all the marks, the scratches, and we wondered, well, maybe those are from the stones, but in fact, those are killer whale teeth marks that they make when they're playing together. But over a couple of years, a couple of summers, when we came back, we noticed that there were these really small thumbnail-sized pebbles that were in this area, and a lot of sand. And in fact, the whales were actually rubbing here. And we don't know exactly why they do it, but it is what we call a cultural behavior, because this particular community of pods of killer whales, comprising about 200 plus individuals, goes regularly to this rubbing beach. Now, at the same time, we were recording the whales, and it turned out that each pod has its own dialect. John Ford did his PhD on the sounds of killer whales, and established that there were dialects. And related pods may share a few sounds with each other, but they also have at least a few unique sounds. And if you go to different parts of the world, the dialects are completely different, as you might imagine. And when you look at some of these orca pods that hunt whales, their dialects are completely different than the fish eating. And in fact, some of the fish eating orcas in one part of the west coast of Canada and the U.S. would be completely different than others. So it was a fascinating way to get an insight into all these different pods. So we spent about 10 summers with these orca families, and learning about them, and learning about the individual stories and the different lives of the ones that went to SeaWorld compared to those in the wild. And we realized that the ones in the wild were threatened with logging. There was a company at that time that announced that they were going to cut down the trees and boom their logs in Robson Bight, in the place where these orcas were, one of their central places right near the rubbing beach. And so with my book, Orca the Whale Called Killer, we started to talk about the dangers of that, and to talk to the different logging companies that were involved and to the government to try to get a protected area. And after a couple of years, we did manage to get one. The last chapter of the book focuses on the work to try to protect Robson Bight and the rubbing beach and the campaign. So I could see that after these summers that I had a story to tell, a narrative, and the new fifth edition of the book which you can see here on the right, published just a year ago, adds stories about my work in Russia since then with orcas, and also going back after 30 years to see the original pods that I met, and finding some of the young ones still around, now grown up, and like Sitica, who was the daughter of one of my favorite orcas, Nicola, whom you met earlier on. So the narrative elements that made Orca work, we had this chronological story through journal entries, events, and dialogue to give the feeling of being right there. And I tried to weave the history, not only the history of killer whales and what we knew about them, but which wasn't a lot at that point, but it was something, going back to Aristotle and Pliny the Elder, and mostly stories of how dangerous they were, but also weaving what we were learning with the science and what the area was like, northern Vancouver Island, the background of the native people who were living there and who fished alongside killer whales, and what they were like. And I had real human and orca characters, and chose those carefully so there were not too many of them, because you can't have too many in a story, but you have to have you want it realistic, but not overly burdensome in terms of the number of characters. And really, the land and the sea itself became a character through the changing weather and conditions. And there was this arc of discovery through the whole book, from knowing nothing to caring deeply. And that was the thing that was picked up in reviews, and was really, and by many readers that I've talked to over the years. So from doing that book, my first book, it really opened the door for me. And the year after that Orca book came out, I had a chance to do the Whale Watcher's Handbook. And I remember writing to hundreds of scientists and whale enthusiasts all over the world, and getting sacks of post every day in the days of where mail was the only way to reach people. And the publisher's idea was just to have a simple guidebook, but I wanted to also to tell the story of whale watching, looking back to Aristotle, who I found was a dolphin watcher, and really this all led to the whole commercialization of whale watching. This was an early step in that, and an extraordinary growth of the industry. And I ended up writing reports and writing all kinds of patients as we traveled around. I was working with a conservation group, Whale and Dolphin Conservation, to try to introduce whale watching to Asia, to Japan and Korea and China and Taiwan, and spent a lot of time in those countries, as well as in Iceland. We gave one of the first whale watching workshops in Iceland that really led to the industry developing there as an alternative to whaling. And I really loved, the whole business of tracing the local industry in Southern California, which had started in 1955, to becoming this global phenomenon. And there was other writing on whales that I did then shortly after, particularly Seasons of the Whale, which came about because I was living in Boston, Cambridge in the mid to late 1980s, and all these whales were dying in the year 1987, and the sea was really being challenged in terms of pollution. A lot of dolphins dying along the New Jersey coast, and people were wondering, what was happening. And when these humpbacks started appearing dead on the beach, one after the other, these were known individuals because, like our study with killer whales, where we were able to identify individuals, they were doing the same thing with humpback whales. They started around the same time off the Cape Cod coast, off Provincetown. And so I used this method to tell the story. I wanted to tell it through the whales themselves, through a year in the life that really changed their lives and changed the researchers and people who were working with these whales. And so I went back through the catalogs for the whales. These are photo identification catalogs, identifying individuals and talking about where they appeared, during their travels from the migrating up from the Caribbean up to Stellwagen Bank off of New England, the Gulf of Maine, then sometimes traveling further north, even as far as Iceland and Norway. And I was able to go back and trace this year in the life with named humpbacks, and it was a fantastic method for getting the real science and then putting it into a narrative that told this story of what had happened. And it was partly a detective story, trying to find out why they had died. And I don't, spoiler alert, it did turn out to be a combination of things, but one of them was red tide that was in mackerel that the humpback whales were eating, and they were dying for the same reason that humans sometimes die when they eat shellfish that are infected with red tide dinoflagellates. So what have we learned from 40 years of studying whales and dolphins? I did a narrative article, actually quite recently. You can find it at this link below. And this led to a book which was an encyclopedia of whales, but not a normal encyclopedia. Even though it's called that, I tried to do it differently with stories embedded in the book with each of the species, and talking about whale and dolphin field studies and everything to try and get readers involved in what it's like to study whales. Now, in the late 1980s and early 90s, I took a break from whales, partly to learn about social behavior. I had a fellowship for independent study at MIT and Harvard University, and I spent some time trailing around E.O. Wilson, the entomologist, ant scientist, in the jungles of Costa Rica. We were lucky to be on an expedition with his oldest colleague, Bill Brown from Cornell, who'd first brought Wilson out of the wilds of Alabama to Harvard at the beginning of his career, and they hadn't been in the field together for 30 years. So they let me take down everything that they said and everything we did, including all the jokes and everything, the details of the scientific work. And it was just a fantastic opportunity to learn about completely different species than I had been used to, and to see how that might. At first, I thought there was an article, but then I became open to what it might turn into. And so the ants are very small, but they're these groups that we were working with, 5 million all female workforce in a single superorganism. These were the leafcutter ants that I made sort of the stars of the book. And the colonies are organized around a single queen with hundreds of gardens. These are actually ants that are gardeners that collect the leaves and carry them into their nest deep underground to fertilize their underground mushroom gardens. And I learned a few things about ants, that they're like whales. Most animals are heavily defined by how many teeth they have, by their mouths, by the business of eating and hunting. Those are the most diagnostic parts. That's absolutely true of marine mammals as well. It was exciting that you could study entire societies and species right um, uh, right there. It's so much easier than studying whales. You might have 50 different species on a single log, which is equivalent to the number of dolphin species in the entire world. But you could have them on one log in the rainforest and you could pick them apart. You could also look at similar species in the same area and start to come up with the evolutionary histories for taxonomy. And ants, I also found it interesting that ants, unlike whales, organize themselves around smells, pheromones, with 15 to 20 of these chemical scents being can organize the entire workforce and the interactions with the queen. So these were the various editions of that first book. Excuse me. And I also learned that Japanese and Chinese love reading about ants. Those editions were very popular, and the books were picked up by publishers there. So the elements, the narrative elements of this book, the key thing, which it took me a few months of thinking about this, even after I'd written a couple of articles on my expedition, I realized that there were these two parallel stories, and I told them in alternate chapters with the lives of a colony of ants told from the ant point of view. So I got down to a few millimeters, an inch at most, off the ground and tried to follow an ant colony, starting with the scouts that go out to pick up leaves, and without anthropomorphizing, just telling it very, very straight, and intertwine that. So at the end of the first chapter, after you've followed this scout ant and the colony and you've seen what goes on, suddenly the ant gets picked up by through by a couple of scientists who are at a tray in the clearing of the forest and are studying these ants, and the scientist holds the ant up and talks about it, and so the point of view then switches to the two scientists, to E.O. Wilson and his colleague, studying them, and that was the dimension then, with the two chapters, every other chapter going back and forth from the two stories, and then them meeting entirely toward the end of the book. So these were real human and ant characters. The rainforest itself was a kind of character, certainly talking about conservation. The method was taped interviews and field time, lots of notes, detailed notes, hundreds of pages, hundreds of scientific papers and books. And there was a kind of arc of discovery of ants and human motivation for studying ants and the rainforest, and the protection of the rainforest and biodiversity. And one thing I wanted to one of the things that fuels the narrative of the book, the thrust of the book, was trying to figure out why this brilliant scientist, E.O. Wilson, decided to study ants and continued with it, and even though he expanded out to work on the rainforest and to work on sociobiology and look at bigger ideas, the ants were really part of the secret of what his motivation was. And so I get deeper and deeper into that as you go through the story until you realize what were the fundamental reasons that he started to do this when he was young. Had a lot of pickup from that story over the following years, with lots of articles that were spun off, and another book, Insect Lives. I found out by reading all these hundreds of papers that entomologists were pretty good writers, and a lot of these papers were read by maybe 30 or 40 people. And with my colleague Ted Schultz from the Smithsonian, who was a student of Bill Brown, the colleague of Ed Wilson, we put together an anthology of the best writings on insects, and it has writings in it and illustrations and cartoons, Larson cartoons, the whole thing. But it was a really interesting way to also express what I'd learned by doing the ant books, and put it in a wider context with insects. And then the film rights were sold to a Berlin producer, and we took around a film project to film festivals and worked with writers to co-write a script that would dramatize the story yet remain true to the subject. Again, trying to do it as a nonfiction feature originally, and then something that would be fiction, but would have authenticity in terms of the dramatic story. But it came close, but it didn't get made eventually. Maybe it will still at some point. So the next book, the last one I'm going to talk about today, is a book called Creatures of the Deep. It actually started as a short kids book, but as I got further and further into the subject, I ended up turning it into a much longer, full-length, 300-page book. And the excitement that drove my interest in this book was, first of all, the new frontier of studying the ocean and everything that we're learning. And there's still a lot of undiscovered species. And I played around with a lot of structures for this book before I came up with 4 separate narratives that would tell different aspects of the story in different ways. So it has 4 parts, and I don't know if you can read that very well, but this part 1 is that's the table of contents. Part 1 is the journey from the surface to the bottom of the sea. So we're going through every layer, and as and I imagine a kind of camera that goes down, and as you go through each layer, you're learning about what the temperature is, the pressure, because the pressure gets really intense the further down you go, how much light there is, what are the species you're seeing, what's the ecosystem, but I also like to tell the history of exploration of that species, so that the top layer has a little bit of Alexander the Great and Aristotle, and then as it gets deeper, it gets more recent in terms of people that have explored that. And that goes right to the bottom of the sea with the first the history of the first explorations of the Marianas Trench, and even the more recent ones by visits to the bottom of the sea by Victor Vescovo and James Cameron, the Titanic director. So there've only been a handful of people that have gone to this bottom of the sea. It's about 7 miles down, um, deeper than Mount Everest is tall. So the second part, fish eat fish world, starting with phytoplankton. So I just start with plant plankton and then move up through, um, one thing eating another until you get up to sharks and killer whales at the top, and tell that story from that point of view. You can see the chapters here under part 2. Gives you an idea. In part 3, journey along the world's longest mountain range. This was imagining a journey. Like the world's longest mountain range is actually the mid-ocean ridge, which comes ashore only a few places in the ocean, the most notably Iceland, where I'd spent a lot of time. So I start this part right in Iceland, and I imagine that you are walking, and you walk down below into the sea, and then you walk along this ridge. And what do you see, as you go along? And and then that leads to the discovery of the hydrothermal vents and the new branch of life and origin of life. I mean, it's really a case of, if you want to tell the story of how the earth was formed, you've got, a lot of that story is in the ocean, and uh, with the spreading of the plates, plate tectonics, and the revolution that happened with that in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So I tell that little science story, but in a very accessible way. But that was a fun chapter to write. And then part 4, counting all the animals in the sea. So I start with Linnaeus, who was the first scientist who gave species their name, the genus and the species, set up the binomial system, and I talk about the Census of marine life that started in 2000. It was a 10-year effort to try to identify as many species as you could, to put in millions of dollars to support, I think it was 180 expeditions. And all these scientific expeditions found about 20,000 species over this 10 years, so about 2,000 a year. And that pace is pretty much continuing. So you're looking at, several species being identified each day. And but still, if we look at the total number of species, it's about 250,000 in the ocean. And the absolute diversity, which nobody knows, but could be 1 million, could be 2 million, we have yet to find out. We have to keep looking. There are a lot of valuable species, and it represents part of our evolutionary history. It's part of us. We came out of the sea as well, and it's up to us to learn about this. And that's what I tried to capture in this book. So there's the world's. The method was just to use all the materials. Interviewing scientists, blending history, science, discovery, and to try and really capture the whole thing as you're going along. This is the world's longest mountain range. You can see here, starting at Iceland, it's just this squiggly line which goes right around the entire ocean and turns up at the end around California. And in the last, I tried to bring the habitat issue into the public domain with some of the chapters of this new book the importance to um, protect habitat, to protect pieces of the sea. And this has become really my obsession over the last decade or so. Um, these are some of the by the wind sailors which are jellyfish relatives that are often blown into shallow water or onto beaches. They're really tiny, but um, they have are indications of sometimes of ecosystems that are not quite right. So we're really doing this huge experiment, and I use the experiment word in a pejorative way, really. That we don't know what's going to happen with the ocean, but we've got to really work hard to try and protect 30% of the ocean, which is the current goal that a lot of countries have signed up to by 2030, if we're going to have something left and something that can help to fight climate change also. So that's the first edition, Creatures of the Deep. It also led to other books, children's book on creatures, a couple of children's books. This is the newer edition on the right, which is coming out in paperback this year. And I wanted to say that at the last chapter of the Vancouver Island, of the Orca the Whale Called Killer, when I concentrated on the push to try to make a reserve, an ecological reserve, in Robson Bight on Vancouver Island. We did get protection for that. However, it was just a very tiny spot, and not nearly enough, and really led me to try to identify where the status of whales being protected all over the ocean, working in my job for whale and dolphin conservation, and also working in Russia to try to identify areas. And I realized how little was protected and how various scientific disciplines were not even aware of each other. The people who were studying whales weren't aware of the marine protected area people, who were doing a lot of research into trying to protect ecosystems. So I put together this book specifically looking at how we would habitats for whales and dolphins and porpoises, and then that went into a second, much larger edition that you can see on the right recently, and I think I'd like to do another book on marine protected areas and keep writing in this area using narrative as this fantastic tool for stories. It comes down to people telling stories, humans telling stories around the campfire. It's something that's very intrinsic to being Homo sapiens. We start to get interested when a story is being told, and I think drawing on that is a really fantastic way to get people involved in conservation. So thank you very much for your attention, and if anyone wants to contact me to ask questions, please use my email address here, or you can contact me through Twitter, and my website addresses are also there. Thank you so much.